2, 1. Moin und Tadotatosch. Herzlich willkommen zu einer neuen Reaction. Dieses Mal gucken wir uns an Making the Case für Wilt the Glitch Chamberlain. Das ist eine kleine Serie, von denen wir uns auch ein paar mehr Videos angucken werden, wo der Herr argumentiert, warum besagter Spieler, in diesem Fall Wilt Chamberlain, einfach der beste Spieler aller Zeiten ist. Es geht nicht darum, ist er es wirklich oder so, es geht einfach nur darum, das Argument zu machen, warum. Finde ich sehr, sehr interessant. Gibt es natürlich auch für meinen Lieblingsspieler LeBron James, gibt es auch für Michael Jordan und so weiter und so fort. Kommen wir überall noch zu. Jetzt ist Wilt dran. Ich sag nur 100 Punkte in einem Spiel. So.
Die Namen sind so hochkarätig, unfassbar. Ja. Aber let's go.
Let's go.
Basketball is special.
Für mich als Warriors-Fan ist das natürlich ein Heimspiel sozusagen.
Und natürlich Video ganz oben verlinkt, ist klar.
That exists. And because of the different styles that basketball allows for, players develop their own distinct identities and signature styles through their creativity.
Außer Wilt.
Flair. And athleticism. And although no player succeeds alone, the scoring volume and two-way nature of the sport give individual stars a nearly unprecedented amount of control over the flow and outcome of the game. For this reason, players are constantly compared to their peers and to the legends of the past in order to answer the most hotly contested question in the sport. Who's the greatest to ever do it? For many, the question is redundant. They believe in only one right answer, their answer. Others might have their own personal stance, but acknowledge one or two alternatives. But I believe that there's much more nuance to the question of greatness and more answers to it than you might think. By my count, there are 8 players in NBA history that have a substantial claim as the GOAT. It's a subjective thing, though. I can't give you a definitive answer. All I can do is make the argument.
Cool.
So today, I'll be making the case for Wilt Chamberlain as the greatest basketball player of all time.
Big Dipper.
Ja.
Der Typ, Alter. Imagine Wilt in der heutigen NBA.
Ja, weiß ich nicht. Ich mach mal einen Ticken leiser, wenn es okay ist.
Kannst du, also das ist für dich individuell, das ist nicht nur für, das ist nicht für mich.
Ah, ja, Hammer. Okay.
The single most dominant physical force basketball's ever seen.
Das war's halt
That's the
nämlich,
case,
ne?
right? First, I tell you that Wilt Chamberlain was and remains the most outstanding anomaly of physical superiority that has ever played basketball. Then I tell you about how his era-specific advantages didn't exist,
okay,
and that Bill Russell had better teammates, which is why he won so many more championships than Chamberlain. That's how the Wilt Chamberlain argument always goes. If I follow that script beat for beat, I'll be making a video that's already been made 100 times. So let's write a different script. We'll hit some of the same notes and see some of the same land.
Das Krasse ist ja, Wilt hat jetzt in den 60ern und 70ern gespielt. Gerade mal 2% seiner Spiele insgesamt sind auf Tape.
Oh.
Also,
so wenig?
Ja.
Das hätte ich jetzt auch nicht gemacht.
Marks. But maybe we can end up somewhere.
Früher war es ja so, in den 80ern war es ja, glaube ich, sogar auch noch, dass NBA Finals Spiele pre-taped wurden. Das heißt, sie wurden aufgenommen und dann ausgestrahlt. Fucking imagine heutzutage.
Where we haven't been before when it comes to Wilton Norman Chamberlain.
Wilton.
Where did Wilt come from? I don't mean where did he grow up. I'm not making a biography. I mean, what did basketball know of Wilt before he stepped into his first NBA game in 1959? We know about the hype surrounding LeBron, Jordan being taken 3rd in the draft, Magic and Larry's college rivalry. And I think it's important to know and understand what Wilt was before he became the Big Dipper. Wilt was the first basketball superstar. Coming out of high school, he had over 200 colleges vying for his commitment, a level of attention completely unheard of for a high school prospect at the time. He committed to the University of Kansas, largely because of head coach Phog Allen's deep ties with James Naismith, basketball's inventor. Of course, freshmen weren't normally allowed to play on varsity in those days, so during his JV season, the NCAA introduced sweeping changes to rules like offensive goaltending and inbounding violations to try to mitigate what they perceived as a threat to the competitive balance of the game. They even introduced rules that would prevent Wilt from dunking the ball from the free throw line for his foul shots after they got wind that
Das müsst ihr euch jetzt mal überlegen, für alle, die mit Basketball ja vertraut sind. Ein Foul-Shot ist, du stehst an der Linie und wirfst den Ball. Du darfst diese Linie nicht übertreten als Werfer, bevor der Ball nicht den Korb berührt hat. Oder das Backboard. Diese Regel ist wegen Wilt Chamberlain, weil er einfach sich gedacht hat, Leute, ich gehe 3 Schritte zurück, werf den Ball gegen das Board, spring und dank das Ding da rein. Mach das 2-mal, 2 easy Punkte. In dem Sinne.
Ja, das ist halt so.
Fucking imagine.
Wilt.
So gemacht, das ist einfach einer.
Es ist basically ein Nerf gewesen.
Ja. Die haben ihn
genervt.
live gepatcht und genervt.
He was doing so in summer scrimmages. And so began the influence of basketball's Goliath. A name fit for Chamberlain not just because of his size, but because of the danger that he seemed to pose to the game's very foundations. Despite the new regulations, in Chamberlain's first varsity game, he scored 52 points and grabbed 31 rebounds. Single-game records for Kansas that still stand today. His first varsity season concluded in the NCAA championship against the undefeated University of North Carolina. The matchup was broadcast on an unprecedented number of radio and television stations, due in large part to Chamberlain's mythical status. The Jayhawks fell to the Tar Heels in triple overtime despite Chamberlain's best efforts, for which he was named the tournament's most outstanding player. And so the seeds of Wilt Chamberlain's enduring basketball legacy were planted. An outstanding player who put forth Herculean efforts and gave us superlative performances that were nonetheless negated by losing. After one final year at Kansas, Chamberlain joined the Harlem Globetrotters in order to earn money for himself until he became eligible to enter the NBA.
Denn damals durftest du erst mit, wenn du das College abgeschlossen hast, in die NBA. Das war meistens so mit 23 ungefähr.
Mhm.
In 1959,
das heißt, er hat einfach gewartet, bis er 23 war und ist dann gegangen.
By the time he retired in 1973 with the Los Angeles Lakers, Wilt had changed basketball more than any player before or since.
Hosen, ne? Alter.
Here are some of his records. Highest PER for a highest career PER. The NBA's all-time leader in rebounds. The NBA's second highest career overall in total defensive win share. Second all-time in win share. Most points in a rebounds in a game. Rebounds in a per game average for a season. Highest rebounds per game average.
Also ein gar nicht mal so schlechter Spieler, wie ihr merkt. Och, das ist so belastend.
Wilt hat 72 Rekorde im Rekordebuch stehen, davon 68 alleine. Er ist nur mit 4 anderen zusammen, die haben das ungefähr dasselbe erreicht wie er. Und sonst hat er 68 einzelne Rekorde. Deswegen, einer meiner Analysten von Fox Sports, Chris Broussard, sagt immer, das NBA Record Book ist die Autobiografie von Wilt Chamberlain.
Wunderbar formuliert. Es ist nichts hinzuzufügen zu diesem Satz.
Wilt holds more records than anyone else in basketball. If someday in the future, every tape of basketball is destroyed, and all of the media and commentary about the game is lost, leaving us with only the record books, people will come to the conclusion that Wilt Chamberlain was far and away the greatest basketball player of all time.
He was
On top of his
NBA.
records, Wilt won 4 MVPs, 3 of which came consecutively and 1 of which came in his rookie year. 2 championships with 1 Finals MVP award. He would have won in 1967, but the award didn't exist yet. He was selected to 13 All-Star teams and 10 All-NBA teams. His resume would have been even more impressive. But things like Defensive Player of the Year and all defensive teams didn't exist back then. His career accolades are certainly impressive, and they place him deeply into the conversation as the GOAT. But the funny thing about Chamberlain's records is that each of them comes with this kind of baked-in asterisk or caveat. Okay, he averaged 50 points for a game for a whole season, but that was back when there were no other players of his size. Or sure, he averaged that many rebounds, but back then the pace was totally different, so they came more easily. We'll get into those caveats about Wilt's era in a second, but isn't it funny that Wilt is the only player whose stats get scrutinized so thoroughly? We as basketball fans are so obsessed with stats and scoring, but when it comes to Wilt, we overlook so much of what he did. We love it when players score, more than anything. Oh, Michael dropped 55 on the Knicks after he came back from baseball. Kobe scored 81 in a single game. But when it comes to maybe the most talented and natural scorer the game's ever seen, we look for ways to discredit him. He dominates the tops of the records so often that I think we've developed a sort of mental filter where we ignore his name and look at everyone else's. For so many of the players that have a case as the GOAT,
Das, was er hier beschreibt, ne, das habe ich halt tatsächlich im Zuge meiner Ausbildung oder später so häufig gehabt. Wir haben einen sogenannten Wahrnehmungsfilter als Mensch. Das ist wirklich so, ne? ohne jetzt böse zu sein, aber wenn du halt irgendwie jemanden siehst, so aus einer Ethnie oder aus einer Gruppe von Menschen, wo du immer schlechte Erfahrungen hattest, dann projizierst du das auch auf den du gar nicht kennst und sagst, boah, scheiß das und das, der ist genauso kacke wie alle anderen. Und das ist bei Wilt, glaube ich, sehr ähnlich. Von dem her, das sind ultra weise Worte, die da gesprochen werden.
GOAT, I find myself having to justify the fact that they don't have the best stats of all time. But with Wilt, I find myself having to justify his stats because they're too good. To understand how he was able to achieve such eye-popping stats, let's talk about what a superhuman athlete he was.
Superhuman.
While he was at Kansas, Wilt was a superb track and field athlete. He excelled at a number of short-distance sprinting events, competed in the shot put and triple jump, and won the Big 8 conference in high jump every year he attended.
Oh mein
damals
Gott.
sind die auf Heu gesprungen. Auf
Oh mein
motherfucking
Gott.
Heu. Was sind Turnmatten? Hier, du hast 2 Zentimeter Heu. Brech dir bitte nix.
Okay, Chef, mach ich nicht.
Ja, in dem Sinne.
Kansas. Arnold Schwarzenegger once described working out with Wilt Chamberlain.
Wilt Chamberlain.
You trained with Wilt Chamberlain?
Yeah, Wilt Chamberlain would be in the gym, but we eventually ended up doing a movie together.
Yeah, Conan.
Yeah, Conan
second
the
one.
Destroyer, exactly. But I was a big fan of his because he came to the gym and he would do a tricep extension that, like, the big guys, the strongest guys, would do, let's say, 120 pounds.
Wie viel sind 120 Pfund? Warte. 70?
54, also knapp 55.
Ja. Okay. So, jetzt, ne, also für alle Leute, 54, 55 Kilo, Tricep Extension, also quasi so runterziehen. Profis, Bodybuilder.
Say,
Arnold Schwarzenegger.
going down, right? He would come and he would do 150, 170 pounds. That's how strong he was.
170
Warte. Entsprechend 77 Kilogramm.
Kacke, 20 Kilo draufgepackt. Pack da noch mal so 2 kleine Kinder drauf, wie bitte.
3 von meinem Erstgeborenen.
Ja.
They always
Nicht
say he
ganz.
was by far the strongest person who's ever played in the NBA.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember that he lifted me up like with one arm like nothing.
Along with Jim
Imagine den Typen, der Arnold Schwarzenegger in seiner Prime, weißt du, wenn der hier richtig aufgemacht, der hebt dir mit einer Hand hoch. Ja, verpiss dich, du Penner.
Terminator.
Ja.
Visiert.
Thorpe, Wilt Chamberlain was the preeminent athletic talent of the 20th century at over 7 feet tall. Had Chamberlain lived in another time, they would have built statues and temples to him. And on top of all of it, he was a tremendous passer
Gold.
and led the league in assists in 1968. That season, he finished with 700.
Die haben zu Wilt gesagt, irgendwann mal, der kann nichts außer Punkten und Rebounden. Was hat er gemacht? Ja gut, dann mache ich jetzt eine Season halt, fokussiere ich mich darauf, Assists zu machen. Hat den Assist-Titel geholt mit 8,2 Assists pro Spiel.
Unfassbar.
Into assists. Just 2 fewer than Ricky Rubio's ever racked up in a single season. As far as his basketball skill set, Wilt's biggest flaw was his infamous free throw shooting. Definitely a deficiency, but not one that I think mars his overall prowess. Some of his success and records surely came from the era that he played in. Basketball was dramatically different in the 60s and early 70s when Wilt was playing. Back then, there were more field goal attempts, which resulted in more
Das ist einfach
points.
so lustig, denn Basketball war damals viel, viel schneller als heute. Im Gegensatz zum Beispiel Fußball, was heute viel, viel schneller ist als damals. Wenn du dir jetzt mal so alte Spiele anguckst von Fußball damals und die joggen da ganz gemütlich, denkst du so, Alter, gib dir mal Gas. Wieso? Die sind schon im Vollsprint. Bitte was?
Mit der Zigarettenschachtel in den Stutzen drin und diesen geilen braunen Ball.
Was sind das in dir schützen? Zigaretten.
That's it, mein Freund, that's it.
Zigaretten. Warum? Ich wurde eingewechselt.
Rauchen.
And available rebounds. And back then, the average player wasn't nearly as athletic as the average player today. Sure, there were other big centers like Walt Bellamy and some others, but Wilt was decades ahead athletically and had an advantage in nearly every game because of that. So that's it, right? Wilt was ahead of his time athletically, competed against scrawny white guys in a faster era that made stat inflation easier. If you were to take a 27-year-old Wilt Chamberlain and put him in the league today, he'd be just another good player who kills it on the glass, like Andre Drummond. No. For one, the advantages of Wilt's era help make sense of how he was able to set such unbreakable records, but it doesn't detract or excuse the fact that he was actually able to accomplish them. Second, yeah, a 27-year-old Wilt Chamberlain straight from 1964, if you plucked him up and put him into the league today, would have been a great player. Would he be an all-time great? Maybe, maybe not, but you're giving him more credit than you think you are when you say that. Imagine you instead took a 13-year-old Wilt Chamberlain and brought him up as a player like every other great prospect.
Ja, das stimmt.
Now he gets to take advantage of 60 years worth of advancement in nutrition, exercise regimentation, recovery science, transportation, and equipment technology.
Damals mit
Especially
Zügen,
advancement in
mit
shoes.
Zügen zu anderen
You know
Spielen
that they
gefahren.
used to play basketball in Chuck Taylors, right? You'd be giving Wilt Chamberlain
Also, ihr fucking imagine, ne, was sie heute an Schuhen haben. Und damals haben die einfach in fucking Chuck Taylors gespielt, mit denen du ja gefühlt nicht mal eine halbe Stunde gerade laufen kannst. Und die sind da durch die Gegend gehopst.
Ja, da war halt auch diese Regeneration, also wie er es gerade beschrieben hat, ne? Das ist in der Tat richtig. Der hatte ja nichts davon.
Nein,
Das
gar
war
nichts.
einfach so, das ist so wie wir. Ne? Wenn wer halt nicht selber trainiert hat, dann war er halt scheiße so.
Richtig. Die haben halt trainiert wie die Berserker. Falsch, was Falsches gegessen. Scheiß doch, hat funktioniert. Den hat keiner gesagt. Ja, heute isst du Low Carb und dann machst du das und dann machst du das. Heute trainierst du nur das, heute trainierst du nur das. Sondern dann wird halt, mach. Du wirst dafür bezahlt.
Die haben ja heutzutage wirklich 30 Coaches für jeglichen Scheiß, ne? Also für alles. Ein Coach für die Beine, ein Coach für die Arme, ein Coach fürs Mentale, ein Coach. Da war nix. Da war also Spiel. Okay.
LeBron, ich glaube, seit ein paar Jahren, also vorher war es immer so 1 Million, 1,5 Millionen, mittlerweile macht er es für 2 Millionen pro Jahr nur für seinen Körper. Masseusen, der hat auch so eine Druckluftkammer zu Hause.
Ja.
So einfach, damit er sich da reinlegt und ja, mit Muskeln regeneriert euch.
Schneller.
Ja.
the opportunity to capitalize on his most valuable attributes. That Wilt Chamberlain would be an all-time great any way you want to look at it. And finally, yes, Wilt took advantage of the inefficiencies of his era. But isn't that what everyone does? Every player has era-specific advantages that they use for their benefit. What's Steph Curry supposed to say? You know what, guys? I know that the game today revolves around three-point shooting, and I'm really good at three-point shooting, but it just gives me too much of an advantage, so I just won't take as many. Of course not. Take advantage of your advantages. It's what great players do. All of this stuff I'm saying might not even matter to you. You might be sitting there with your arms crossed saying, nope, Wilt Chamberlain can't be the best because he played in the past. And I didn't see him, so he can't be the best. And honestly, I get that. As sports fans, we want to see the best. It's why we watch. What fun is it to admit that the best player your sport's ever seen started his career the same year Alaska was admitted into the Union? It happens in everything. Music, film, sports.
Sie haben
It's
da
the
Öl.
struggle between nostalgia and recency bias. But just because it might be a bummer to admit that
Yakult.
you didn't see the
Oh mein
best
Gott,
doesn't
Yakult.
mean it can't be true.
Hannes,
So why can't a player
Darmbakterien.
from the past be the best? I'm sure a lot of you, though, might be willing to concede that a player from that era could be the best, but you wouldn't say it was Chamberlain.
Digga.
I'm sure some of
Digga.
you are saying it's his rival, Bill Russell.
Wow.
Russell won 11 championships in 13 years compared to Wilt's 2. Russell was described as
Richtig. Also, das ist ja das, was ja viele sagen. Er hat halt 11 in 13 Versuchen. Das Ding ist aber auch, da waren die Playoffs halt 2 Runden. Du hast halt gegen den einen gespielt und warst im Finale. So, da
Das
war's.
ist super, super schwer zu vergleichen. Das ist gar nicht möglich.
Überhaupt nicht. Also heute, was du heutzutage alles durchmachen musst, damals waren das, keine Ahnung, 16 Teams, wenn überhaupt 10? Keine Ahnung. Jetzt sind wir mittlerweile bei 30 oder so. Oder mehr sogar. 32,
Ja.
glaube ich.
Ja, 32.
the ultimate competitor and as a leader who time and time again inspired and enabled his teams to succeed. And that brings us to the crux of Wilt Chamberlain's case. History says that Wilt was the ultimate athletic specimen who excelled in every physical sense, but who had a critical lack of killer instinct. According to his reputation, Wilt was missing the leadership abilities and intangible mental qualities that are required to win. Wilt is remembered as someone who chased stats, was a bit of a head case, and could never figure out exactly what it was he wanted from basketball. Because of that reputation, Wilt remains an intensely polarizing player. So if I want to make the case that Wilt was the greatest basketball player of all time, I have to find a way to assuage the idea that he never had what it took to be a winner. To do that, I want to use Bill Russell as his analog, because they played in the same era and because Russell represented everything Wilt couldn't be or do. They're remembered as inverses of each other and embody contrasting ideas. Team versus individual, defense versus offense, me versus we, and ultimately winning and losing. But why are they remembered as representing things so starkly? Again, because they're from the past. They're practically myths and legends at this point. There's less footage of them than there is of other great players, and because the narrative became easy to write as their careers went along. David beat Goliath, and nobody roots for Goliath. But was the fight even fair for Goliath? For starters, Bill Russell consistently had better teammates than Wilt Chamberlain did. That's as good as a fact to me, and I will maintain it even when I make the case for Bill Russell.
Wie viel weiße Dudes da einfach
Wilt
waren.
played with great players in his career, but Bill played with Bob Cousy, a league MVP, John Havlicek, who went on to lead the Celtics to 2 titles in the 70s, Sam Jones, a 6-time All-Star and master in the clutch, and other Hall of Famers like Tommy Heinsohn, Casey Jones, and Frank Ramsey. And of all the great players that Wilt played with, he usually caught them at the beginning or the end of their careers. Aside from notable exceptions like Jerry West and Hal Greer. Obviously, it's easier to be a better teammate when you have a better team, but I think that the most important factor that Russell benefited from, even more than his teammates, was the leadership afforded to him by his head coach, Red Auerbach. Red was one of the most forward-thinking minds to pass through the NBA and is still on the Mount Rushmore of head coaches. Of the Celtics' 17 championships, Auerbach was a pivotal piece in 16 of them, either as Boston's coach, general manager, or president. He drafted Chuck Cooper, the first African-American, into the NBA and hired the first black NBA head coach in Bill Russell. Red was an intense, competitive coach who adapted his methods to suit his players. In his own words, if you have some great potential players, there are 2 things. 1, you help make them great. 2, you devise a method of play that is suitable to their talent. And that's the thing that I think Wilt lacked more than anything. A coach who could lead him, tell him what to do and how to do it. Wilt was a prideful guy, and he cared about what people thought about him, which is one of the most natural and human things to care about. Of course, the thing that most people knew Wilt Chamberlain from was basketball, and as a basketball player, Wilt was constantly ridiculed by the media for not winning championships every single year. As he began to develop this reputation of a loser, he started scoring more points so that he could say, well look, I scored all these points, I got all these rebounds, I did my job. And so he became known as a selfish scorer. And what did he do? He led the league in assists. What do you think people said about him then? That he was stat obsessed. And so goes the legacy of Wilt Chamberlain.
Das ist genau das, was ich meine, dieser Filter, ne?
Who could help him channel all of his abilities into a winning style of play. No different from guys like Kobe or Michael. I'd argue that if Wilt had played for a great coach like Red Auerbach for his entire career, he would have experienced every modicum of success that Bill Russell did. I promise I didn't just pull that theory out of my ass. I'm arguing that because it happened.
Das Video ist auch super. Skip gegen Skip.
The 2 seasons that Wilt won it all, 1967 and 1972, were marked by the influence of outstanding coaches on Wilt's game. Alex Hannum coached Wilt for 3 full seasons, in 1964 on the San Francisco Warriors, and in 1967 and 8 on the Philadelphia 76ers. When Hannum was hired by the Warriors in '64, he inherited a team that was beginning to unravel. The franchise had been sold during the season and relocated from Philadelphia to San Francisco, leading to the retirement of veteran scorers Paul Arizin and Tom Gola. As a result, Wilt shouldered the scoring burden and averaged 44 points and 24 rebounds a game, believing that doing so was the only way to keep the Warriors competitive. The effort was in vain though, as the team lost over half their games and missed the playoffs. And so, Hannum went to work, changing the team's approach and trying to implement strategies that would lead to winning basketball. By May of that season, this was the headline in Sports Illustrated. the article describes Chamberlain as exactly the kind of player you would hope he could be. He was scoring less, depending on and trusting his teammates, was defending at a high level consistently, and doing all of the little things that led to the team's success. By all accounts, that change was due in no small part to Hannum's influence. Unlike every coach before him, Hannum had stood up to Chamberlain, and in doing so had earned the superstar's respect. When Hannum stressed the importance of team play and defensive intensity, Wilt listened. The result was a 17-game improvement from the year prior and a trip to the NBA Finals, all with a team that had barely changed in personnel. For the first time in his career, Wilt Chamberlain, the player who could do anything as a player, was learning how to play. The following year, the franchise found itself in financial trouble, and the owner traded Wilt to the Philadelphia 76ers for cheap players and cash. Wilt won 55 games with the club in his first full year there, and by the following season, Hannum had been hired to replace Dolph Schayes as head coach. Philadelphia started that season an unprecedented 46-4. By the end of the season, Wilt had averaged just 24 points a game, the lowest he'd had at that point in his career, to go along with nearly 8 assists and 24 rebounds a game. 6 players on Philadelphia had point averages in the double digits.
Rebounds.
Wilt's abilities hadn't changed. His approach had. That Philadelphia team finished the regular season with 68 wins and 14 losses. The best record the NBA had ever seen. After dispatching Oscar Robertson and the Cincinnati Royals, Wilt found himself facing a familiar foe in the Boston Celtics. But with superb teammates and an outstanding coach, Wilt led the 76ers past Boston in just 5 games, ending the Celtics' 8-year reign as champions. In the finals, Wilt defeated his old team, the San Francisco Warriors, in 6 games to claim his first championship and cap off the most outstanding professional campaign the NBA had ever seen. A year later, Wilt led the NBA in assists, en route to a league-high 62 wins. After a 7-game loss in the playoffs in the Eastern Finals, Hannum retired, and relations between Wilt and the 76ers ownership had soured. He then demanded a trade to the Los Angeles Lakers. With the Lakers, Wilt was saddled with coaches Butch Van Breda-Kolff and Joe Mulaney. Not exactly household names. The Lakers had good seasons under those coaches, but were never able to climb all the way to the top of the mountain. Bill Sharman, a hard-nosed, no-nonsense coach, took over in 1972. That season, the Lakers went on to win 33 games in a row, a record that still stands. That Lakers team finished with a record of 69-13, surpassing the mark set by Wilt's 76ers 5 years earlier. In the playoffs, they lost just 3 games on their way to the championship. Jerry West said of Sharman, "He told us he thought that if we played the way he wanted us to, that we could beat anybody. He got us to believe that right away, and he did it without raising his voice once all year. As for Wilt, he was simply the guy that got us here." So there you go. That's my case. Wilt was a victim of pressure and a lack of consistent quality coaching. You might be saying, but Clayton, what about college? Wilt lost that UNC game under Fog Allen, and that proves that he's fundamentally a loser. And that's where you're wrong. Because fundamentally, Wilt never played for Fog Allen. Allen turned 70 at the end of Wilt's freshman year, and 70 was the mandatory retirement age for state employees in Kansas at the time. They appealed it, they lost, Allen retired, and Wilt didn't get along with his replacement. In Wilt's entire career, he had exactly 2 great head coaches on 2 different teams.
Unglück.
Both times, he turned in seasons that broke records for wins and ended in championships. So much for not being a winner. I know it's a what if, but if you'd given Wilt a coach like Red Auerbach for his entire career, he'd have the most decorated resume in NBA history. But remember, we're not talking about the greatest resume. We're talking about the greatest basketball player of all time. And by just about every metric that exists, we're talking about Wilt Chamberlain. One last quote from Chuck Klosterman. Russell possessed intangible greatness, which means sport writers can make him into whatever metaphor they desire. Russell was the central figure for a superior franchise, so history suggests he was the greater, more meaningful force. His wins validate everything. If you side with Chamberlain, it seems like you're siding with the absurdity of numbers. But consider this question. In an alternative universe and with a different attitude, could Chamberlain have been Russell? Probably.
Sicherlich.
Could Russell have ever been Wilt? Never.
Nope.
No chance. Chamberlain is the only human who could have ever been Chamberlain.
Schön.
Ja,
Schöner Schlusssatz. Wirklich.
richtig.
Der Typ hat's drauf. Richtig gutes Ding.
Und in dem Sinne, haut rein. Bis zum nächsten Mal. Lasst es euch gut gehen. Ciao, ciao.
Tschö.